Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today we welcome you once more to a CE3C Encontro Ciência, and we are quite pleased to have today as our speaker Tiago Capela Lourenço, who I thank from now because it's great to have you here and to be able to hear your work and to share with us what you've been doing. So the talk will be recorded, so you can ask questions to Tiago through the chat, or at the end you can ask directly. Tiago will be presented by Elise, to whom I now give the floor. I would like just to advise you that as the talk will be recorded, you can, if you don't want to appear, you can keep the video turned off. Elise, thank you for being with us and for presenting Tiago.
So good afternoon or good morning to everybody. I have the honorable role of introducing Tiago, that I accept with great pleasure. Tiago is an environmental engineer with a PhD in environmental sciences by the University of Lisbon. He is an invited assistant professor at the Faculty of Sciences of the University of Lisbon, and he is also an assistant researcher and research manager at FCIVA. Tiago has specialized in working across systems, scales, and disciplines, and integrating multiple areas of knowledge related to climate change adaptation, climate risk management, and environmental decision-making. Tiago is also the coordinator of the thematic line of climate services in CE3C, and is also a very dear colleague of the subgroup He Changes, always ready to help. And thank you for that, Tiago, and thank you also for the presentation. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Patricia, and thank you, Elise, for the very kind words and kind introduction. Always willing to help is something that I appreciate. Thanks, Elise. So without further ado, I'll skip to the presentation. Thank you all for joining and for your interest in our work. As Elise and Patricia mentioned, I'll be presenting a little bit of ongoing work. Today I chose to present you something that is currently being framed by the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is climate resilient development pathways. And so what I'll do is I'll try to quickly frame the work I've been doing, which just started in a European project called Resilience, and then go through some of the key concepts and challenges of this climate resilient development pathways concept, which has been proposed in the last assessment report 6, but also in the previous assessment report 5, and which marks a little bit a departure in terms of IPCC thinking. Later on, I'll try to propose or to discuss some ways forward on how to move these concepts, and this is quite very conceptual and new into practice, and I'm looking forward for discussion with you and with questions, because I know several of you work in areas that connect well with this notion of climate resilient development. So very quickly, just tell you what's the project that's framing this work and this review. Resilience, regional pathways to climate resilience. So this is a H2020, so European Horizon 2020 coordination and support action. This was funded in one of the last Green Deal calls from the Commission. It just started in autumn last year, and it will run for 4 years, but this is actually part of a larger group of projects. So it's one out of 4 projects under this Green Deal call that have a very specific objective of being front runners for the EU mission on adaptation to climate change. Just before I go into the mission, just to present our partners. So it's a fairly small project. It has 8 partners. It is led by the Institute for European Energy and Climate Policy, along with Fresh Thoughts Consulting, and it consists of an interesting mix networks, local governments, cities, with research companies and other sorts of consultancies. So the major objective of resilience is to support European communities, cities, and regions in their efforts towards building and developing climate resilient pathways, and hence the review I will present you today and the discussion of today. And it follows a sort of demand-driven approach to facilitate the identification and upscaling of well, some of the most promising resilience solutions, and then try to replicate it in 10 of the most vulnerable and low capacity regions in Europe, while at the same time, obviously building local capacities for resilience and adaptation, and obviously with an emphasis on research and on innovation. So as I mentioned before, the climate change adaptation mission is one of 5 European missions that have just been launched. Others include fighting cancer, promoting healthy oceans and promoting healthy soils, and also climate neutral cities. But the overall objective of this particular one, this adaptation mission, is to lay the base to prepare Europe for climate disruptions through a better understanding and better preparation of how to manage the risks. And you can see some of the risks highlighted here on the base of this pyramid.
Tiago, sorry, yeah. We are not. Well, I thought you were not yet showing the presentation.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No,
so something went wrong here.
The first part. So I was.
Share screen. No, sorry for that. Can you see it now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Didn't realize that. Apologies. So I'll just quickly go through the slides you've missed, which are the overview. So introduction, key concepts, climate resilient development pathways, from concept to practice, ways forward. This was the title slide. Resilience, you just heard me talk about it. Coordination action, along with 3 other projects, which I will present in a bit. The logos of our partners, very important, of course, and what I was just saying, and this is where I guess you cut me off. The idea of supporting communities in building and developing climate resilient pathways through the identification and the upscaling of some of the most promising resilient solutions, but then also to replicate them across some of the most vulnerable and low capacity regions in Europe, while promoting research and building local capacity for resilience. And this is the slide where I was, so you didn't miss much. I was just telling you that the basis of this climate change adaptation mission is to better understand and prepare. Let me just grab the pointer here, and prepare for manage some of the most pressing climate risks, such as heat waves, forest fires, and others, and to prepare Europe at its regional basis for climate disruptions. To do this, the objective is to have 150 communities and regions where transition to a resilient future is accelerated towards developing visions and innovative pathways. But also to promote funding, of course, because funding is very important in order to have the enabling conditions for those solutions to be operationalized. And then in order to demonstrate how to do it, the plan is to have 75 demonstrators where solutions that trigger transformations are upscaled later on to the rest of Europe. Obviously, there are other European policies that are of interest to our work and to the mission itself. So these projects I mentioned are the front runners of this adaptation mission, but there are many more will come. So just last month there was another call for several projects, and other calls will follow. And another important policy is the EU Adaptation Strategy that connects with this mission, and several mission contributions to the 4 key adaptation strategy objectives of well, conducting smarter adaptation through climate data and some of the most well-known climate data platforms and climate adaptation information platforms, but also to move away from silos and into more systemic adaptation, making regions collaborate, making regions think about taking a systemic and more holistic approach to climate action, making adaptation faster. Like I said, demonstrations of systemic transformations, development of common frameworks for analysis of risks, but also testing and scaling up innovative solutions. And obviously, a fourth, which is stepping up international action, making these regions work not only within Europe, but and across Europe, but also with the rest of the world. So how did we start looking at this? How did we start looking at this issue across Europe? As you probably understand, Europe is not that homogeneous, although we tend to think it is. And obviously there are issues across Europe, as for example the innovation performance of these regions. This is a regional performance group. So a sort of indicator, scoreboard of regional innovation, and it becomes clear that Eastern, Southern, and also here our Iberian Peninsula are obviously lagging behind, as expected, Central and Northern Europe. Although we do have in the North, Center, and North quite some clusters of innovation in, for example, in Portugal. And obviously this connects well with the potential vulnerability to climate change and with the so-called, although I don't like this wording that much, losers of climate change. So for example, we can see where multi-sectorial hotspots of climate change under a global warming of 2 degrees are located. And again, they are located further south, especially, for example, here in the south of the Iberian Peninsula. And this connects with what resilience and also the other projects will look like. But it's not all about climate change, and this is going to become clear in a bit. And so we also need to look at socioeconomic and energy systems and other sort of systems that are the basis of well-being in Europe and across the world. And for example, if we look at the GDP, the gross domestic product per NUTS2 region in Europe, we again see a similar situation where the poorest regions are located in the eastern, southern, south, and southwestern part of Europe against the wealthier nations and the wealthier regions of the center and north. But also, if we look at, for example, coal and fossil fuel production and power plants, so coal-fired power plants across Europe, again, we see that, coal is produced mainly in the eastern part, northeastern part of Europe, and coal-fired power plants, for example, exist a little bit still throughout the entire European area, with some clusters here in the Iberian Peninsula and in the north of Central Europe. Obviously, we know these indicators are changing I was going to say every year, but I would argue with the recent war or invasion of Ukraine by Russia, if you've been following that, which I assume all have, I would say that this landscape is changing by the day, if not by the hour. Just yesterday, we heard about the Commission's objective of weaning itself out of Russian fossil fuel dependency, and so this is the landscape against resilience, and the other 4 projects will be looking at these climate resilient pathways and how this relates to development across Europe and climate action, of course. So our starting point was based on these indicators I've just mentioned. We did, right from the proposal stage, identified 51 of the most vulnerable regions based on their vulnerability, obviously, to climate change impacts, but also to the innovation level that they have. the socioeconomic and economic perspectives, in this case, GDP, but also if they are part of the just transition, if they are a just transition region. For those who are not familiar with the concept, the idea of just transition is that, okay, we need to move away from fossil fuel dependency into and promote renewable energy and other sorts of transitions. But there are regions where those transitions are much harder to accomplish than others. And we can see here, for example, that in Portugal, Alentejo is considered one of those just transition regions where, either because we have mines or because we have power plants, fossil fuel fired power plants, there will be a special attention given to the region. So from this starting point of these 51 vulnerable regions, we also have a very strong, well, it's just beginning, but it will be very strong in the future, collaboration with the 3 other projects I mentioned, RCNOE, Impetus, and Transformar. These are the innovation actions. So this is actually where the research is supposed to be done in terms of how to move these regions towards resilience. So far, we have been able to map 22 regions, or that's 2, 3, or smaller, where these projects will be doing their demonstrations of how to move towards resilient, climate resilient development, and to each 22, we're going to add the 10 resilience replication regions that will be chosen from that group I just showed before. And this is the landscape where these different solutions will be tested. So the rationale behind all of these, and this is going to take me directly into the IPCC framing and the science framing of these sort of concepts, is that we need to look at success and failure, for example, of how adaptation has been integrated into planning and funding, and the findings related with these, with the risks of maladaptation, of course, with a lot of adaptation is being laid on the ground and planned, and a lot of these may actually turn into maladaptation and create vulnerabilities elsewhere, or impact vulnerable groups within these regions, but also the development of common indicators, sources of funding and financing, including the famous PPPs, climate risk modeling and uncertainties. So all of these will be crucial for the development of these regional resilience pathways. But to be honest, nobody really knows how these pathways look like. So the first questions we are posing right now is, what are these pathways about? How do they work in practice? How can we measure their success or failure? Will these pathways work everywhere across Europe? Who will be responsible for their implementation? Who needs to be involved in their creation and then monitoring? And finally, who actually pays for all of these? At this stage, we obviously understand that there's a lot of interest in the Commission to push this forward. So also the Commission has been paying for these initial developments. But then what I'm going to present you today, so this was sort of an introduction to get you to the climate resilient pathways in the IPCC, which is what I've been reviewing lately. So the notion of climate resilient pathways it is fairly new. It was already somehow described in the AR5 back in 2014 and called climate resilient pathways. The latest AR6 report, just launched a couple of months ago, changed a little bit and added the development notion to the pathways. I've been reviewing both chapters and many more chapters in the IPCC, so this probably accounts for 300 or more pages. This is not an easy concept or group of concepts to master, and that is why I wanted to present you and get your feedback on your ideas, because I know several of you work in areas that connect nicely with this challenge. So I'm going to just go through some of the key concepts as they are defined in AR5 and AR6: resilience, development, climate resilient development, pathways, but also then a little bit into what are these system transitions and this transformational change that is required or not to reach these transitions, in order to understand how these pathways come about. So as I mentioned before, this is taken from the latest AR6, a summary for policymakers. This represents, and I know some of you who are here recall this figure quite well since the early 2010s, I would say 2012, and this, as I mentioned, sort of represents a point of departure in IPCC approach, because it moves a little bit away from the climate risk into the climate resilient development. And hence, obviously, we understand, and the literature is filled with information on this, that climate change obviously impacts human societies and ecosystems, including biodiversity, and that there is a connection between the two. But the urgency for action has pushed the literature into looking into this human development and climate resilient development, where, well, we understand that we need to push for transitions in the human systems and also in the ecosystem systems, but we need to account that they are connected, and we are pushing issues such as well-being, equity, justice, and human health, and bringing them forward in the discussion around climate action. So this is quite a move, and I would say an aspirational move from the IPCC side, and we are looking into the different concepts in order to, well, how to make these concepts operationalized in all of these different regions and such a heterogeneous landscape. So resilience, I'm sure that if I would ask each one of you, you would have a potentially slightly nuanced version of this concept, but the IPCC defines it as a capacity of interconnected social, economic, and environmental systems to cope with hazardous events, trends, and disturbances, but while maintaining their essential function, identity, and structure, and also, in the case of ecosystems, biodiversity, of course, and also maintaining the capacity for adaptation, learning, and transformation. And this is exactly when resilience, when a system is resilient, resilience is a positive attribute when the system is able to maintain its capacity for learning, for example, and for transformation. And why? Because we know that across communities, sectors, and households, they will have to deal with disturbances, but also with surprises over time. And so adaptability and transformability of the different systems is quite key to this notion of resilience and climate resilient development. So the second concept that we think is important to understand is how the IPCC currently defines development. Again, the literature obviously is huge and enormous about development, but the IPCC defines it as efforts being both formal and informal to improve the standards of human well-being, and it has added this notion that this is very particularly important to places that are historically disadvantaged by colonialism and other features of early global integration. And obviously this pushes toward thinking about the global south and the problems of the global south versus the wealthier nations of the global north. But as we've seen in that landscape that I just showed you, this is, even within Europe, there's a lot of heterogeneity, and this is what needs to be understood when we're talking about development. And current development pathways are actually leading us away from rather than towards sustainable development. And this has been reported in a lot of the recent literature. So climate resilient development has come about as a process of implementing not only greenhouse gas mitigation, but also adaptation measures in support of sustainable development for all. This is especially important as the prospect of crossing the 1.5 global warming level approaches. But we need to acknowledge that this is a very relatively young concept. So there is little literature that focuses on what motivates action in pursuit of this type of development rather than its subcomponents. I can speak for myself. I was always very interested in adaptation and not that interested in mitigation aspects of climate action. But I do recognize that we tend to move into silos, and that this idea of motivating action that pursues the three aspects is quite interesting in my view. And finally, obviously, pathways. Pathways, we understand it's the temporal evolution of these systems towards some future state that we hope is sustainable. And we know that they range from a set of quantitative to qualitative scenarios, the use of narratives of potential futures, obviously, and also solution-oriented decision-making processes. It is true that the pathways approach, this pathway approach, typically focus on biophysical, technological, and economic views, but also social behavioral trajectories. And one of the difficulties is obviously that they have to cross different scales. So we come to the concept, which is in the title of this presentation, the climate resilient development pathways. As I said, this has been brewing or growing since AR5 and in subsequent IPCC reports, such as the 1.5 report. And the idea that these development trajectories are interactive and continually evolving processes is the basis of this notion. So these trajectories, these development trajectories, should successfully integrate mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development to achieve the development goals. And at this point, they are merely conceptual and aspirational ideas. So this is the idea of steering our societies in Europe and hopefully everywhere in the world towards a low carbon, but also prosperous and ecological safe futures. So we understand that this is a lot to ask. And obviously there are several challenges ahead. There are plenty of challenges, but I just selected two, which I think would be important for CCIVA and for many of the work that we are currently doing here in resilience. But I assume that several of you would also accompany me in these challenges, which is, well, first of all, there's an explosion of pathways currently. So just the IPCC IR6 defines 9 different types of pathways. The 2 that I just mentioned, plus adaptation pathways, development pathways, again here the old silos, I would say, emission pathways, overshoot pathways, something that's also quite interesting and that the IPCC explores to a great extent. And then the famous RCPs, representative concentration pathways, SSPs, the shared socioeconomic pathways, and the sustainable development pathways. So this explosion of pathways obviously doesn't make it easy for science to wrap its head around these trajectories, but also it doesn't make the lives of policymakers and the lives of decision makers across Europe and across these regions easy.
Para mim.
Someone is asking something? No. The second challenge is actually the current framing of development. So as we frame development now, we link economic growth to human well-being, and this has turned into decades of policies and projects that aim at growing economies. And so the very process that have contributed to the current climate challenges, including economic growth and the resource use and energy regimes, for example, are also the pathways that are currently considered as the improvements in human well-being. So this is actually creates a problem because current modes of economic growth create significant challenges for climate resilient development and actually place climate resilience and development in opposition to one another. And that is why it is so difficult to, without moving towards a finer understanding of development, it will be quite difficult to move towards this, well, sustainable state in these trajectories. I'm sharing this image, this figure, because I think there are 4 key messages here that I think are important. Well, the first one is obviously that there are different routes to reach climate sustainability or climate resilient development and sustainability, and that the choices that we are making now and that we have made in the past obviously can influence, because societal choices can move us towards climate resilient development or can move us away from climate resilient development. But we don't know exactly the choices and how they will be laid in the future, and so we are crunched. Our decision space is sort of crunched in time. On top of it, we have obviously climatic and non-climatic shocks. And these are very important. We just had COVID-19 at the time this was produced. I would argue that in 2022, we have a major war in Europe, which is a non-climatic shock of great extent, and that can push us towards either side of this sustainable development and climate resilient development spectrum. But there will be others in the future. And the third message that we have is that these dimensions of climate resilient development, people, prosperity, partnerships, peace, which is funny to read now, and planetary boundaries, for example, these dimensions, they are sort of like sliders that can go up and down according to the decisions that we make collectively, and obviously in these regions, and that will be the focus. And so they can go from social justice or injustice or equity to social injustice and inequity in a heartbeat, as we've seen since February 24th. And finally, the last message is that the time is running out for the window of opportunities for transformational climate resilient development is closing fast. That is why some of the core elements that underline the pursuit of integrating resilience into development consider that climate change poses a potential risk. I think this is well understood by everyone, and that we are dependent on achieving transitions in a set of key systems. But at the same time, we need to be putting equity and social justice as central to the design of interventions in these regions. And these interventions will obviously be contingent on the presence of multiple enabling conditions, which are not easy to come by. And obviously also the involvement of different actors, which need to be pulled together in order to come about these system transitions. The process of changing these systems, and the IPCC considers 5 major systems: energy, industry, urban and infrastructure, land and ecosystems, and a 5th one that was added later, which is the societal system transition. Although they don't necessarily need to be transformative, these transitions. System transitions are often identified in the literature as being necessary for processes of large-scale transformations. And this is what is currently being discussed in the literature in the IPCC. So you can see here those, 4 major system transitions with cross-sectoral here, including the societal one. The IPCC has now also moved towards a definition of representative key risks, which are a way of sort of clustering major risks from climate change into a manageable components. And what we see here in this table, in this figure, which is a little bit overwhelming, is that, the IPCC has gone through some of the most typical climate responses and adaptation options in each one of these systems, and try to understand their feasibility potential, but also which dimensions of this feasibility are present. And you can see here that, for example, something that I think it's quite dear to CCIVA, terrestrial ecosystems and land are the ones where the potential feasibility and the synergies with mitigation are at a high confidence level to be feasible, or that the feasibility is high, along with energy systems and critical infrastructure, of course, against, for example, water security, food security, and obviously peace and living standards and equity, where the feasibility of proposed actions such as livelihood diversification and many others are maybe not as feasible as some of the things that we study here in CCIVA. So in a nutshell, and just to wrap up, I would say that if sustainable development is the ultimate aim of these 4 projects and obviously of the Commission, and if we think as mitigation as the way or the only way to keep climate change impacts moderate rather than extreme, and if we also think about adaptation as the strategy, so the response strategy that not only keeps these impacts moderate or are suffering from these impacts at a moderate rather than extreme level, and allows us to cope with the impacts that cannot be avoided, these climate resilient development pathways are the context that shape the choices and the actions that are taken. This is quite important at the regional scale. And so the next steps for resilience are obviously to understand the key characteristics of these real life climate resilient pathways. How do we measure resilience in these trajectories? We understand that some characteristics of resilience can be useful, can provide useful insights, like for example, the capacity to foresee risk, the need to decrease the impacts, the capacity to respond rapidly to uneven or extreme events. We also understand that considerable amounts of proactive adaptation will be required, and the support of balanced environmental management will be, that cuts across the entire spectrum of environmental problems and global changes will be required. But how do we account, for example, for transitions and transformational change in these regions? And most of all, how do we operationalize this concept across all these regions? There are lots of examples, and this is what we are working right now. For each one of the for the focus transition systems, we have plenty of examples. I like the first one because at the time this was written, fuel switching from coal to natural gas seemed like a very specific option that facilitates energy systems. But just after February, what's happening is a little bit the opposite, because we need to wean ourselves down of Russian natural gas. So we've seen several coal-fired power plants being switched back on. And so this, for example, illustrates the difficulty of operationalizing this concept. But what we'll do now is that we're going to go over this multitude of options and incorporate them into a spectrum that considers different energy system different system transitions across the 5 core elements, and assess them in terms of how they connect also with the adaptation options, but most of all, how do they fit into each one of those demonstrated regions? Because obviously we cannot expect to adapt a rural, poor Romanian or other Eastern country or even Portuguese region the same pace or very fossil fuel dependent region, the same way we will transition Northern and Central European regions where that transition, for example, to low carbon economies will be easier, while at the same time not risking livelihoods, not risking well-being, and obviously peace. And I'll finalize my last slide with some, well, I would say provocation for CCIVA. This is the same system transitions and the same climate responses and adaptation options, but they are here mapped against their observed relation with different sectors as ecosystems and services, ethnic groups, gender, and low-income groups, but also with the relation with the sustainable development goals. And as we can see, there are some areas here that haven't been assessed by the IPCC, either because the literature was scarce, or because the information was contradictory and not very the confidence in that information not very high. So, for example, forest-based adaptation has not been assessed against any of these sectors and groups at risk. Neither has agroforestry, although we understand that there are positive relation with many of the sustainable development goals. We haven't assessed them, for example, in terms of gender and ethnic groups. So we haven't assessed them in their trade-offs and synergies. Well, not us, the global literature, the IPCC, against these sectors and groups at risk. The same with resilient power systems and energy reliability and disaster risk management. So I think that there's a lot of work that can be done in CCIVA in combining mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development, very much in line with what the IPCC is now currently framing. Thank you all for listening, well, you have my contacts, you know where I am. Looking forward for questions if there are, and for your examples, of course.
Thank you very much, Tiago. Great presentations. So now we have time for questions and discussion. I don't know who wants to start, so I give some time for people. Lots of people clapping.
Yes, can I?
David, yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tiago, for the presentation.
Hi, David.
First of all, I was wondering why the G in the resilience, not related with any point. My question for you, you talked about mitigation and adaptation, this tentative of working together. And I was wondering what you know about this tentative approach between the risk community and the adaptation has been also related with these problems of the wording, as you showed to us these 9 different definitions only in the pastoralist. Has been this approach has been following and has been effective, or somehow they are working in parallel? And thank you for the insights.
Thank you, David, for the question. Yeah, the G it's from regions, so it's a region resilience. It's sort of a tongue twister, I guess, but so that's how the resilience came about. So something. Okay, thank you, Professor. So the question you asked, obviously, you've worked with me for several years on this idea of risk community, climate risk management, and the link to adaptation. I wouldn't say that it has disappeared from the IPCC. It is there, but I would say that it's not as advanced as we would imagine after some of the projects that we have run. But it is incorporated, and that figure that I showed you, where you're going from climate risk management to climate resilient development, more than showing a separation between climate risk and adaptation. I think it shows the interest of, well, IPCC, but also UNFCCC to put development at the core of the discussion. And one of the reasons, and this was told by some colleagues from other projects, one of the reasons is exactly that the disconnect between, for example, adaptation and climate risk management, or disaster risk management, to be more precise, show them that there are still a lot of integrational gaps. And so what they're trying to do now, which is even more aspirational than in the past, is to bring everybody together, including the development community, which maybe for Europe, and I confess that I struggled in the start of the project, because I mean, when I think about development, I think about North and Global South, and I think about developing countries and non-developing countries. But because this is at a regional scale, the projects are looking at this at the regional scale in Europe. There's a lot of differences between regions in Europe, which can be considered development differences. And so I wouldn't say that the risk community is out. It is still in there. The focus is a bit on adaptation and development, but the risk community is definitely, obviously, involved and required. But it's a good question, David. I have to check on the other 3 projects, how well represented they are, because to be honest, I don't know.
Great. So we have time for more questions.
reacting to the Tiago's provocation. Meanwhile, others are
Thinking
about questions. Tiago, you provoke us saying that the forestry and the agroforestry are still not there's nothing, no results or something like that. And you talked about in general that normally is due to lack of data. Do you know any specifically to these two topics? And I know why have you raised them. Do you know is because of lack of data, or are there other various challenge to that?
Yeah, thanks for that. I don't think it's, I mean, when I say lack of data, it's lack of integrating data, not lack of data on agroforestry and on forests, of course. That's a lot of that. There is a lot of data on that. What I think the IPCC is signaling to us is that, for example, when you talk about land use change, you don't tend to think much about livelihoods. So, for example, we know that agroforestry systems, such as the Montado and others, are in danger because of well, not in danger, but in stress, maybe. It depends where you stand in the in the literature, but are in stress related in relation to climate change. And we know that that stress causes livelihood to be lost. So farmers and other sorts of livelihoods connected to the land. But we don't see much about the stresses on livelihoods coming from the adaptation or the mitigation. So we don't usually think about climate action as something that can cause livelihood stress. I think the best example is this just transition discussion, where we are starting to close factories, power plants, and other fossil fuel burning installations. And well, there are people who lose their jobs. There are people who cannot, well, they are very skillful, trained workers on that area. And therefore, we need to address that livelihood, socioeconomic development perspective. And in agroforestry and in forest, or forest adaptation, as the IPCC call it, there's not that much on this. So you tend to think that, well, I'm doing agroforestry, or I'm doing forestry, renewing, afforestation, well, any sort of project. And this is good because this is good for the climate. And you tend to think, well, what are the people? Is this good for also the people and for other ecosystems around it, and for the connectivity of all these problems? Another example is the urban areas. For example, we tend to think, okay, we are moving our mobility to more soft and low carbon processes and modes. And obviously it's beautiful that we can fill cities, even like Lisbon, with bicycles and other soft modes of transport. But we know that there's a huge community of people who will not ride a bike or will not be able to move in these systems, either because they are vulnerable or older, or simply because they are poor and they live far away from where they work in the city center. And so, for example, what about public transports? Part of the development of these urban areas needs to be heavily dependent on good public transports. And this is a choice. Sometimes there are trade-offs. If you invest in one, you're not investing in the other. And this is what the literature is signaling to us. Think about it in move away from your adaptation silo, like I had, or from your agroforestry silo, and think outside, because often there will be vulnerable issues, vulnerable groups and sectors that are affected by the responses we make, not let alone by the climate impacts. Not to mention gender and equity issues, which well are ripe, of course, and are large. So that is the message, I guess.
Okay, thank you. It's clear. There is the systemic perspective, not lack of data. Thank you.
Yeah.
Tiago, and now we have Alice.
Sorry, it's just a comment on what you were discussing with David. About this evaluation of the social consequences of the changes that are or are not made in agroforestry and in forestry as well. And it reminded me that mainly in forestry, and I'm talking specifically about the Portuguese context. So usually people receive money to do whatever they do regarding the plantations, because most of the territory in forests is private. And so the way people see it is that we should plant these because we receive money to do these. But when I say these, it is, in many cases, it is not an adequate answer regarding climate change adaptation. And so this is linked with one of the aspects that is mentioned in your presentation, the payment for ecosystem services, which is really critical. And for people living in rural areas, the subsidies they receive, the incentives they receive for whatever they're doing are really key. And so it depends not only on their will, but on the politics that are in place to support them in the choices they made. Just a comment.
No, thank you, Elisa. It's more than a comment. It's a fundamental question, because these climate resilient development pathways are not just for individuals. They are for policymakers. So the idea behind the mission, for example, on adaptation, and the other missions, of course, ending cancer or trying to end cancer or have healthy soils, these were sort of taken out of the US book back in the 60s with going to the moon mission. So the idea behind this is that, okay, Europe needs to transform itself now. And for that, we need clear-cut missions to help us navigate the environmental challenges. And so what you just said is fundamental, because people don't decide the subsidies. They receive the subsidies. They are at the end of the subsidies. Who decides the subsidies are the policymakers, hopefully using the best available knowledge, which, as you say, sometimes has trade-offs. And one of those trade-offs is the environment and climate resilience. And so the idea here is that we can give these regions, including the regional decision makers, the possibility to imagine a future where, to be resilient, they need to incorporate all these perspectives. This is not going to be easy, but it's exactly as you say. People plant something because that's where the money is coming from. So what actually needs to be transformed or maybe transition is actually the policymaker that defines the subsidy, not the. So this is, I don't see the literature as pointing out to, okay, we need to transform, people need to transform themselves alone. This is not the context. The context is much wider. That's why we need to consider all the scales. So, for example, the forest and agroforest examples that you gave in Portugal, they are, I really hope that Alentejo, for example, is chosen as one of these demonstrators, because I think that it would be quite interesting for, say, Treche, if this occurs, also include also for change, the associated lab, because it will, this is still very much up in the air. And we know that, for example, that system ecosystem service payment in the CAP, in the Common Agricultural Policy, is not going that well once again. So the silos are there and they are really difficult to penetrate. I think what the Commission wants with this is, okay, let's shift our focus from now on. Let's not forget the livelihoods of people. I know some will grab this idea of livelihoods and say, okay, if they are planting these and they are earning their money, if now you shift to something else, they will lose that money. And they will push for the status quo. So this is going to be, I think, quite a difficult journey in the next decade or so, especially under the current energy situation. But thank you for that. That's very insightful.
We also have one more question
From
Ru, yes. Thank you very much, Tiago, for the talk. So my question is in two parts. I hope you can hear me well. For decades, scientists have been warning the public and governments of the pace and effects of climate change. but they have not been heard as they should. Even now, a week after the last IPCC report was delivered, several governments, including Portugal's, have given the green light to 7 new fossil fuel extraction sites. It's clear that we need to act fast. So, do you think that they would now listen to this idea of mitigation done fast if they did not listen when they were warned and could have avoided the situation? And secondly, what is the role of the scientific community taking into account the huge gap between the scientific solutions and their implementation by politicians? Thank you very much.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Hu, for that question. Every time the IPCC comes out, there's a flurry of messages saying time is running out. Just as I said in that figure, the window of opportunity is running out. I think that several of these warnings have been heard, and we tend to think that nothing has changed over the past, but the fact is that it has. For example, in Europe, we clearly have moved towards decarbonization with bumps on the way, but I mean it's undeniable that both in most of the countries the public support towards a greener economy and a greener livelihood is there. We see it on the streets, we see it on the newspapers, and also the political perception has also changed over the years. And I think the IPCC work is fundamental, and all these different little projects that we have and that sometimes we feel don't contribute much, I think that they do contribute. And the way they reach the policymakers, for example, thinking in terms of communication, something that Patricia, for example, is doing a lot and we were discussing before, is fundamental. So things are changing. I know that new fossil fuel sites are being proposed. We know that there's a lot of discussion, for example, with the EU taxonomy on what is a green or sustainable activity, which is going to define the near future of financing these projects. For example, the discussion around the inclusion of nuclear energy as a green transition energy. So all of this is very complex. If I had to give you a straight up answer, I would say that they are listening. The policymakers are listening, but this is not the only thing on their minds. They have a lot of other things on their minds, and this creates such an inertia over time that for us scientists or general public, it sort of feels like things are not moving. But if you look at this, when I started working on adaptation back in, I don't know, 2005 or 2007, things are much different. You see a clear evolution, but it's a very slow one. And what IPCC is saying, and what the literature is saying, is that this window, because now we have a lot of information based around the Paris Agreement goal of 1.52 degrees. And that has been, unlike Kyoto, which was, okay, we need to mitigate, we have targets for mitigation. The Paris Agreement gives us a temperature target. And we are already at 1.1, 1.2. 1.5 is probably 2030, 2035. So that's 8 years from now. And so I think these messages are very strong and powerful because they give you a benchmark and they give you a target. And you are about to cross that target. So you need to change now. If they will listen, I think so. I'm positive. I'm optimistic, sometimes too much optimistic. And I think that they will have to listen because I mean, the pressure from the public together with climate impacts and extreme events, I think will make several of these systems have to transition themselves or face dire consequences. Regarding the goal of scientific community and the difference between what the solutions are proposed and then the politics, that's a very long and old discussion. Do we need to, I remember, and David for sure remembers this, we had colleagues that said in the past, no, we need to educate the policymakers about the environment and about climate change, while others say, don't patronize policymakers. And I think that I tend to think of science as a sort of neutral in terms of process, even if you are not neutral. Even if you as a scientist personally have a very strong opinion, and I have very strong opinions about this, if you put the solutions there and if they are backed up by evidence, then it's easier for you to show them, showcase them, and show how they connect across this adaptation, mitigation, sustainable development. If you tend to be more on the side of you guys are not hearing us, and you should listen to us, but if you don't propose the solutions in a way that they are tangible, things are harder to come by. And I think that's the great advantage of these demonstrators. I think the mission is all about that. The mission is, okay, we're going to grab a fragmented landscape as the European one. We're going to grab some high vulnerability, low innovation areas. And we're going to show that it is possible here with some funds, of course, with financing coming from the European Union, to shift into a low carbon, but yet sustainable and sustainable, resilient, and well-being focused pathways. So, but yeah, your question is on the money, of course. If we had a crystal ball, we would probably be scared, because we don't have. We need to keep our faith.
So thank you very, very much. I guess we don't have any other question and we need to finish. Tiago, thank you very much for this great hour and great Encontro Ciência. And thank you all for your presence here and for all this discussion and questions. I hope to see you next week in the next Encontro Ciência. And until then, stay safe and well. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.